Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on best practices for teaching in a Redbird. We'll go ahead and get started, and maybe we'll have some more people join us. Just as a administrative point, couple administrative points. This is being recorded and will be available on our website after the session, and we'll send out an email to anyone who registered for the webinar with the recording in it. Additionally, this webinar is really built on your questions. I mean, that's really what makes this so interesting and valuable. So please use the question feature of GoToWebinar and type in any questions you have whenever you have them, and I'll take some breaks and get to them and answer any questions as they come up. So let's go ahead and get moving here. My name is Josh Harnagle. I'm the VP Marketing for Redbird Flight Simulations, and I'm also a CFI, II, and MEI. As some of you may know, Redbird ran a flight school in San Marcos, Texas called Skyport for a number of years. And I was involved in the management of that, both on the marketing side, but also on the instruction side and curriculum side. And before that, I helped run the Redbird employee training program that utilized our sims heavily, obviously. And before that, I was a full-time flight instructor in the Washington, D.C. area. So I have a lot of time, a lot of experience, both training in a non-simulator environment and then also in a Redbird simulator environment. I've been involved in the creation of our curriculums and GIFT and a whole bunch of other things that really help round out the tool set of using a Redbird. So, I've given this webinar and this talk probably more times than I've given anything else. We've done it, I think this may be the third or fourth time we've done it as a webinar. I do it every year in Migration, our user conference. Well, in a normal year, I'll do it at Migration. And I've given it in Oshkosh, I think, a couple times. So you can go back and watch some of the older ones, and you'll notice that things have changed a little bit. And that's because this is an evolving process. And we'll talk about it a little bit as I get into it. Some of the things that I thought were best practices early on, I've been convinced are actually not, by our users, by our customers. And so I've kind of changed and evolved this talk to go along with what I think and what we think are the best ways to use the tool. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. What we're going to be talking about today, we're looking at what the Redbird is really good at and what it's not. I think it's important to understand what the tool is and how to use it, and when you should use it, when you shouldn't use it, and that kind of, if you get just that, the idea of what the Redbird is in your head, that a lot of the rest of this sort of flows from that one concept. We'll go over some keys. I have a nice checklist of things that instructors need to focus on when they're in the sim. We'll do a couple of examples, and I do have a little focus at the end on emergencies and judgment, because it's something you'll probably pick up during the course of this webinar. I'm a little opinionated about the way instruction should be given, and I think we do a disservice in most, especially primary training, primary instrument and VFR and instrument training, and not giving students the correct foundation to make decisions. We focus a lot on sort of rote checklist procedural stuff, but what we really need to do is create pilots who can make decisions on completely unforecastable, unforeseen events, and deal with uncertainty in an appropriate way. And this sim is great for that. And we'll have lots of time for your questions. So first off, I got a little poll that I'm going to launch here in a second, but the question is, have you instructed in a Redbird before? And this kind of gives me a sense of what the audience has done and can kind of guide my direction a little bit. So let's go ahead and launch that. The poll's out now. So have you instructed in a Redbird before? 3 simple answers: yes, no, and not yet, but I will soon. Go ahead and give people just a few more. We'll give it about a minute or so to let people vote. It looks like right now we're about 50% yes, a third no, and about 20%, 17% saying not yet, but I will soon. So it looks like most of you have voted. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We'll close this poll, and the majority have instructed, but we have actually a fair Actually, it's right down the middle. 50% said yes, they have instructed in a Redbird before. 33% said no, and 17 said not yet, but I will soon. So it's a mixed audience. That's good. Those of you that have instructed in a Redbird before, feel free to in the questions box, if it's not really a question, but more of like a suggestion or a comment or something you do, go ahead and put that in there. And if it makes sense, I'll read it out to the group. Okay, so moving on, what the Redbird is, and this is key. The Redbird is a tool. It is like that hammer or that screwdriver. It performs a specific job in a specific situation. And if you try to use that screwdriver when you were trying to put a nail in, we all know that's not going to work very well. And that's the right way to look at the Redbird, is what is this tool useful for in this situation? Now, the Redbird's a pretty powerful tool. It's more like a Swiss Army knife than it is a specific, like a screwdriver or a hammer, and it's got a lot of abilities to do. And so the range of things that we can use it for is pretty wide, but it's important to recognize that it is a tool, and it is not an airplane. And so when you approach it as though it is an airplane, and you essentially use it as an airplane stand-in, what ends up happening is the customer's experience of that training is oftentimes not particularly good, because you get frustrated that it's not doing things exactly like the airplane is supposed to be doing things, and the training value of it is really diminished, right? So if you want to go fly in an airplane, I suggest you go fly in an airplane. If you want to work on specific skill sets and build competency, the Redbird can be a really good tool for that, but don't treat it like it's an airplane. All right, so real quick, this slide's pretty easy. Most people kind of generally get this, and especially when it comes to instrument training. You know, historically, especially in general aviation and all forms of aviation, simulators are really used for instrument training, and that's where the bread and butter of it happens. And but we've had a lot of experience using simulation in ab initio early stage training, private pilot training, and it works really well for all these things too. And what's really nice about using it in private pilot training especially is that your average pilot has so much to learn to get from Joe Blow on the street to rated certificated pilot, that there's a ton of stuff that can be pulled into the simulator at a lower cost, higher training value, and they can still get more than their minimum flight hours and meet the requirements for the FAA. And when they come out the other end, they're going to be a much better pilot if they're able to utilize the simulation in a way with an instructor that understands it, knows how to use it, and at a school that really values it. So basic, straightforward stuff: procedure training, maneuvers training, checklist, avionics, that kind of stuff. Let them figure out where the cockpit is. How do I perform a steep turn? How do I load an ILS? How do I brief an approach? All that kind of stuff is pretty straightforward. People really understand that. The situational awareness part, I think, is a real area where we lack, where we don't do a very good job of teaching our students, giving our students the skills. What we generally do is we put them in situations and we sort of brute force it, so they learn how to think ahead of the airplane. We say things like, if you're what's the most important thing in the airplane? The next thing. Where are you going to be in 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes? We, as an instructor, we say those things, but we don't really give them the tools to learn that. And the sim can be a great place to really learn how to manage your situational awareness and get some understanding, because you can simplify things down and let their mind actually focus on things outside of the specific controlling of the airplane. Humans just don't have enough RAM available to them to process everything that's happening in the airplane on a conscious level all the time. They have to start bringing some of those processes subconsciously, and that comes with experience. We know that comes with experience, but to get that experience, sometimes it can be really helpful to give it to them in the simulator. Decision making, emergency training, again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, and I think people kind of understand that the sim can be good for that. There's the cliche of going to the your recurrent training as an airline pilot, and you spend 3 days in the sim and it's awful and everything breaks. So I think people kind of understand the idea that sim's going to be used for emergency training, Redbird's going to be used for it. But there are some specific guidelines that we need to keep in mind, and we'll talk about those as we get on. So again, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the question box, and we'll get to them in a second. Maybe don't use a Redbird for this. And now this is the slide that has been adjusted the most. The part of my talk has been adjusted the most as I've done this, because I used to say things that were too broad, and my customers, our users would come back and say, no, actually I do use it for that. So I used to say things like, don't teach landings. But actually, what I mean is don't teach the flare. You can teach everything up to the landing. You can teach power management, glide management, altitude, airspeed, all the stuff that goes into setting up for a nice landing, how to fly a pattern, how to line up with a runway, how to deal with crosswinds. All that can be taught in the sim. What I would really be hesitant about doing is putting a student who's just learning how to land in the sim and having them do a bunch of landings, do a bunch of flares, because that is so seat of the pants, and no sim does that well. Even the big level Ds don't really do that seat of the pants coming in for a landing particularly well. And it's such a important time in their learning, especially like, let's say where I'm really talking about this is, let's say you go through all of your maneuver stuff, right? They can do steep turns relatively well. They can do stalls and slow flight relatively well. And we're now to the part where we're just going to go bang out 10 landings in the pattern just to get them to that first solo. In that section of the training, I really would be hesitant to put a sim, to let the student land the sim. What we want to do is preserve the experience of landing the airplane and what it feels like, what it looks like, all the sensory sensations, so that they can really focus on that. We get so few, that's such an important critical time of the training that we really ought to make sure that that we don't interfere with it at all. And now the next item on here, I'm sorry, my windows are popping up all over the place. Stall buffet detection training is probably the next area. And now this gets in a little bit to my personal opinions about training. I think we do a disservice to a lot of our students in that we don't train the stall particularly well. If you look at the ACS, which is how we train students, and we, as much as we'd like to say we don't, but generally speaking, most training, especially the private pilot and instrument level, is towards the test, right? We train to the ACS so they can pass the test. Now, the ACS is pretty good. It covers all the main things you need to know as a pilot, and if they can pass the test, you will probably be a pretty good pilot. However, the stall is a little bit different in my mind, because I imagine if you pulled your average pilot out there and you ask them, describe a stall, what's a stall? The first thing they're going to start talking about is airspeed. And as you know, as any good instructor knows, it's really more about angle of attack and critical angle of attack. And there's such a thing as an accelerated stall, which is a real gotcha kind of thing. And if you look at a lot of what we call stall spin accidents, or they might not actually be in a spin, it might be a stall spiral. There's a really good talk, I forget his name, but there's some really good research right now on how a lot of the stuff we classify as spins is probably more of a spiral. But anyways, that's a lot of that came out of an accelerated stall situation where the pilot had some airspeed, more airspeed than what they are typically used to stalling at, so above the bottom of the white or the green arc, and they had some wing loading. They were in a higher G maneuver, and all of a sudden they're stalling at 90 knots or 100 knots or whatever that case may be, and it might come out and bite you. So one of the things that I really like to teach as a private pilot in a private pilot training is detecting that buffet in the stall. So feeling, as you approach the stall, feeling the controls vibrate a little bit, feeling it in the seat of your pants, and the fact that that feeling happens not just when you're at 54 knots with all the flaps down and full power. You know, like it happens in other situations. It could happen at 90 knots in a 2G turn in a 172. And there's a specific feeling that the airplane makes when it's getting close to the stall. And every airplane is a little different. It's all related, you know, that most of them have a similar-ish feeling. And so if you learn it in a 172, you go fly 182, the stall buff, it's going to be roughly the same. I think that training is super important, and we need to make sure we do that with all of our students early on. I really think like a falling leaf is a great maneuver to do with a student in an airplane to get them comfortable with stalls and feel what the stall feels like. Don't do that in the sim. You know, the Redbird, the way you're not going to get there's going to be no feedback in the yoke or the controls. You won't feel any of that vibration. You won't feel any in the seat of your pants. The airplane will get sluggish and kind of behave weird, but you know, that's a little bit less. See, look, that's the vibration I'm talking about. You can't really point at it. And the way our simulation engine works is that inside the normal range of operation, it's pretty good. It's going to be pretty close. When you get outside the envelope there, when you get into the stall category, into a stall situation, or when you're spinning, or if you're going super fast, I mean, the wings will break off. But especially in the below a stall speed or below a stall in a stalled condition, it just doesn't behave all that accurately. So I would kind of hesitate to do that. And on this topic, I'd also put in here something about spin training. I'm an opinionated guy about this. I think most private pilots should probably see a spin, and certainly should learn spin recovery procedures and spiraling dive recovery procedures. The sim's not a really great place to do that. The procedures work, but the spin doesn't feel right, doesn't look right. Now, obviously, with modern avionics and people with queasy stomachs, going out and spinning a real airplane can be a little bit of a touchy subject. So that's outside of the scope of this conversation. But and then the last one is aircraft ground handling. I used to say taxiing, but again, I don't know that that's really accurate, because you can learn all the taxi procedures. You can learn how the airplane taxis. So you push the left rudder, push the right rudder, push the brakes, blah, blah, blah. You can learn aircraft, you know, taxiway and runway markings and how to navigate on the ground looking at an airport diagram. Those are really important skills. The sim is an awesome place to learn. But if you've flown a Redbird, you probably know this. On the ground, the thing drives around like a Zamboni. It doesn't really behave like an airplane or 172 or any of the training airplanes that you'd fly. It doesn't really behave like that on the ground. And just as a point of reference, the reason that's happening is because our simulation engine doesn't really understand the difference between flying and driving on the ground. From a physics perspective, there is basically what happens is that the rudder becomes more effective when you're on the ground. The effectiveness of the rudder shoots through the roof. And so you are legitimately sliding around on ice almost when you're taxiing the Redbird. So that's not great this is how this much rudder pressure will generate this much turn. So you kind of have to be cognizant of that. So that said, show them how the airplane will taxi, like how the controls will work, how you have the throttle, blah, 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 how to read the runway markings. But they're going to have to go out in the real airplane and spend 20 minutes taxiing around to get a feel for what the rudders are like. So let's move on. So questions. Let's look. I think we have a few questions. Let me look through here. Yes, there will be slides available. You can also send an email to me, jharnagle@redbirdflight.com, and I'll get them to you, or info@redbirdflight.com, and we'll get them to you as well. That's it. No questions. So it looks like I'm doing just a fantastic job. So I know I'm not. So go ahead and send some questions if you have them. But we'll move on for now. The keys to teaching in a Redbird. All right. So let's start with another poll. This question is a little bit more touchy. What's the biggest obstacle to effective training in a Redbird? Let me go ahead and launch that. All right, so it's out. Biggest obstacle to effective training in Redbird. 1, Redbird lacks realism or features. 2, the instructor doesn't want to use it. 3, the student doesn't want to use it. Or 4, other. Go ahead and go ahead and answer this question as best you can. And understand, I only gave you four possible options. So, if you put in other, maybe either in the questions or the chat or something like that, go ahead and type in your what you think the other obstacle is real quick. Give this just 1 second. All right. About half of you have voted. We'll give it a couple more, few more minutes here, a few more seconds, and then we'll get going. Okay. All right. I think we'll move on now. Here's an interesting one. Let me close this. Okay. Biggest obstacle to effective training in Redbird. 20% of you think the Redbird lacks realism or features. 50% think the instructor doesn't want to use it. 30% say other. One of the others, it's interesting, it takes too much space to place it. Well, I would say that's an obstacle to buying a Redbird. Let's talk about using it specifically. So in my experience, and now I'm gonna obviously say I'm biased, right? I work for Redbird, they pay my bills, but I'm also a big believer in the product, honestly. Outside of working for Redbird, my experience has always been the biggest obstacle to effective training is the instructor's attitude. All those problems with realisms and features, that's there, right? It's a sim, it's not the real thing. You could probably you could spend more money and find sims that do other things better, right? You could spend $500,000 and get a sim with a real G1000 if that's what you wanted to train on. But the truth is, it's close enough for most training activities. And that's really what the product's designed to be, right? It's designed to be relatively affordable and be good enough for 90% of the training activities that you need to do. So if you say it's probably that, then what's really the key is that the instructor attitude, because the student, generally speaking, either has no opinion about the simulator because they've never been in one, they don't know, or more likely they have a somewhat positive opinion about the simulator because they know airline pilots fly in the simulator, and a lot of our students want to be airline pilots, and they think that flying in a motion sim is pretty darn cool. So what happens is the instructor doesn't want to fly in the sim, probably because they want to log hours, right? Or and that may be the main reason they don't want to fly in sim, but they'll find a reason why, oh, it's not real enough, like, if I go into this menu, this sub menu of the aux page, I can't do this thing, so I can't use it. Or, yeah, that approach is out of date, so we can't use it. Well, the argument there would be how often you need to use that sub menu for most of your flying activities, or B, if you can fly a localizer or an ILS approach or an RNAV approach, does it really matter, practically speaking, if it's out of date or not? The procedurally, it's about the same. Now, we want to keep your approaches up to date. There are options to do that, etc. But from a specific training, especially in the private instrument world, basic instrument training, it's pretty much there. So what happens is the instructor will say, it's not really worth it. Let's not waste our time with it. And the student picks that up immediately. And now that student, probably for the rest of their flying career, is going to view the simulator as kind of like it's not really worth it. But if I have to, because the insurance or my company mandates it, I'll go in. So that first interaction with the instructor and the simulator is super important. The instructor has to value the training. And this is really a tough subject, because we know most instructors want to log time, right? They have a job to get to that outside of instructing, and the simulator doesn't allow them to do that. there's a management function here. The management of the flight school has to insist on it, has to put it into the curriculum, has to teach their instructors how to use it, teach their instructors the value of it. And their instructors, you know, I would say 90% of instructors, even though they want to get their hours, they want to go on, they do really care about their students' success. You know, you'll find the occasional bad apple who really doesn't want to, really doesn't care about their students' success. But, you know, at the end of the day, most instructors want their students to be successful, and the sim will help them become successful. So helping them develop that good attitude towards it is really, really key. We got a couple questions, and I think I'm going to go through them here. Gary says the simulator does very well for what he wants to demonstrate. Great, I appreciate it, Gary. Thank you. I think one obstacle is because the instructors want to fly in the real airplane, but not the simulator. Yes, that is absolutely correct, Miguel, and we kind of talked about it. Unfortunately, you kind of need to either have the instructor, you know, come to some understanding that this provides really good value for their students and can really help student outcomes, or you have to insist on it from a management's perspective. Okay, so we have another question here. It's about navigational databases. Let me make this a little bigger here. Okay, disconnect between database company and Redbird, pointing the fingers at each other with issues, and the many frustrating. Well, Alexi, I'm very sorry for your experience with that. And yes, the database, navigational database stuff is definitely a struggle. If you want to send an email to me specifically about this, I can try to help. It's jharnagel@redbirdflight.com. And actually, I can, Joey's on here. Joey, can you send an answer to Alexi with my email address, and maybe we can help him out? All right, so keys to teaching in a Redbird. Next one, realism matters. And when I talk about realism, I'm not talking just about the sim, right? The sim does need to be real enough to be effective training, right? For sure. But there's only so much we can do on that. As far as, you know, you own a sim, or your flight school owns a sim, and there's that's really what you have. So what can you affect? When it comes to realism, things I'm talking about is, let's say you have one of our larger sims with that moves, or even I think some of the ones that don't move have it too. There's a seatbelt in there. Put the seatbelt on. Put a headset on. Plug it into the intercom. Use the headset to talk back and forth. Brief a flight beforehand. We're going to go through a whole thing about that, but you would never get in an airplane without looking at the weather. You'd probably never get in an airplane without spending a couple of minutes talking about what you're going to do on that flight. Don't ever get in the sim without doing the same thing. Brief the weather that's going to be in the sim session when you start. Talk about what you're going to accomplish on that flight. Take it seriously, and don't let the student go off on the video game track. It's very easy to start a training session, and then you guys get bored because, you know, you get bored, and all of a sudden you're flying loops down the strip in Vegas. You're never going to do that in a real airplane, and now that simulator is a video game, and it will take a lot of work to get the student to actually value it as training. All of these, if you really think about it, so far these keys have really been about creating the idea in the student's head, this is valuable, worthwhile training that they take seriously. If they can do that, you're 90% of the way there, and the time you spend in the sim will be way more effective than otherwise. Most important button in the sim is the pause and unpause button. But I'll say most instructors probably overuse the pause button. Knowing when to pause and unpause is a real important skill that kind of develops with experience. You want the students to be able to deal with situations in real time, right? That's what they have to do in the airplane. So what you're looking for is task saturation. When a student reaches that point where they just have no more RAM available to process the situation and no positive learning will happen, pause, take a break, look at what's going on, talk the situation through, and then unpause it. If maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they're behind, but they're trying to keep up. Their legs are still turning, they're moving, and they may be able to pull the situation out. Let it run, because that's really good training for what's going to happen in the airplane if they get overwhelmed. And you'll find the earlier on in the training, the more you pause. The later on in the training, the less you pause. But in general, I think most instructors probably pause a little too often, honestly. Now you can build a whole curriculum around this idea, and we have on our website, various places you can find a private pilot and instrument curriculum that are really built around the simulator. The idea that you learn something on the ground, either with King Schools, Sporties, ASA, whatever, with ground school, with your student, with one-on-one ground instruction with your instructor, with the instructor, you practice that thing in the simulator, and then you perform it in the airplane. You never want a student to learn something in the airplane. They should never, ever do something in the airplane first. They should always do it in the sim first. If you embrace that as an idea, boom, all of a sudden you have a well-integrated simulation curriculum into the simulator, and you have high utilization of the simulator. And it like just that one idea, never do something in the airplane that you haven't done in the simulator, will drive a lot of the outcomes that most owners and CFIs are looking for. Gary mentions that he always pauses right before the crash, and I think that's a good, generally speaking, a good idea. There may be some situations where you want them to actually crash, but I mean, it's kind of easier to handle from just a system admin's perspective if you pause before they crash, because then you can reset and try it again, etc. All right, so instructor guidelines. This is kind of that little quick checklist thing that I've talked about. Let's go back. The instructor must reinforce the value of the simulation, have a goal for every training event. Never hop in the sim and just go for it, right? You brief every session and use real world weather, and you check it, and we'll talk about that in some detail. Say headsets, seatbelts. Now these last three, or the next three, keeping failures realistic, limiting failures, and not creating inescapable situations, are all kind of in the same boat. There's a lot of instructors, when given the instructor panel, right, where you have all the ability to change the weather and failures and all that kind of stuff, will put students in these situations that are just crazy, right? They have an alternator failure, and then they have an AHRS failure, and then they have, I don't know, a GPS failure, and the weather goes downhill, and they have a thunderstorm, and as they're maybe they make it because they're really good pilots, and then right before they land, the instructor fails the right brake, and so they hit the ground, hit the left brake, and they go off the end of the runway. All you've done is created a training environment where the student says, the simulator sucks, I die every time I get in it, and it's impossible to fly. So you don't want to do that. You want to keep things realistic. Obviously all those things could happen on a flight, but that would be an extremely rare, extremely bad flight. More likely, you'll have marginal weather and an alternator failure. That's a great situation to put a student in. They have to deal with the weather, they have to deal with the alternator. And if you've ever been in an airplane that's having issues, or the weather's having issues, I actually find it's pretty rare to say when it's a clear-cut decision that this is an emergency or not. There's a lot of gray area, like, well, maybe it's just the mixture's running. Maybe the engine's running rough, but I'm not sure exactly what it is. I don't think the engine's going to quit. It's a small thing. Or maybe the weather's marginal. I don't know, when's the line where I declare an emergency? Those are great situations to put students in, when things are marginal or just on the edge of being really bad, but not clearly dire. Those are great situations for the student to be in the simulator. And then the last one, so in general, I try to keep things to 20% of the try to keep things to 20% of weather events, in the session, just so every time they get in the sim, it's not some awful experience or there's something that happens. That way you can kind of you lay the framework for creating those situations where they have to make some judgment calls later on. And don't create inescapable situations. There should always be a way to get out. They should always be able to make a good decision and get out of it. They may not make a good decision, and that's okay. They can make a bad decision and let them suffer the consequences of that. But we should always give them the ability to make a good decision, essentially. And knowing when to pause. I think that's, again, we talked about that a little bit, but I think that's really key. So let's go on. We've got a few questions, comments kind of things. All right, so we got Thomas says, the ability to pause on pause has been the most beneficial capability to me. It shortens the learning timeline, allowing me to retain what was working, evaluate where things went wrong, reset and re-engage 30 seconds. 30 seconds prior to when I lost things, makes for more retained learning within the time frame, equals better value for time and investment in the session. I agree, Thomas. I think you're using the pause button correctly if those are the outcomes you're getting. What I'm specifically talking about are situations where the student is still learning and they haven't gotten to the point where they've recognized that something's gone wrong, or maybe they don't. They're totally removed from the situation because they're so overwhelmed. That's when, or they're not removed from the situation because they're overwhelmed. That's when pausing can be sort of detrimental, essentially. And Gary, alternator is my #1, and then agrees with the weather at limiting it to 20%. So that's good. Let's go on to our next slide here. Using real world weather. I talked about that some. This is what I like to do. So if you think about, if you're a normal pilot, basically every pilot that I know checks the weather in the morning, just about every morning, whether they're flying or not, and oftentimes uses a weather service to do that, in my case, ForeFlight. So when I was actively instructing all the time, I would check the weather in the morning, and if it looked like one of those days that was either one of two things. One is kind of a standard day that my students would see often in that area, I would do this. Or two, if it was an interesting weather event that I would want to show to a student, I would do this. And what I do is I get a full weather briefing for flight on that day, and I take screenshots, in this case of ForeFlight. And then I can put those screenshots together in a binder or a shared Google Drive or something like that. And then you build a mission with Navigator. And if you don't know how to do that, that's a slightly outside of the conversation here, but we can talk about it. You build a mission, you save it, and you say, this is VFR flight #1, corresponds to this weather. So the student gets in and you say, okay, we're going to go fly today. In this case, we're going to fly from Austin Executive Airport to College Station, Texas, Gig 'em Aggies, at 5,000 feet. We're going IFR. We're leaving at 1 o'clock. Here's your weather briefing, right? With a full flight plan that they can look through. And they get a full flight plan generated by ForeFlight, just probably the tool that they use. If you don't use ForeFlight, you use whatever tool you use. And they get all their information, winds, etc. We look at our surface analysis chart in this day. For example, what I'm looking for, why I chose this particular day is it's very common in Texas this time of year, where we have some front that's north that's pulling moisture in from the Gulf of Mexico. And in the morning, you'll notice that at the time of this briefing was pulled, which would be in the morning, we were IFR. We had 2.5 miles of visibility, few at 200 feet over Austin Executive. And it's marginal in IFR throughout the surrounding area. And the destination is marginal VFR. Very common. Low clouds, very thin but low clouds. And in IFR world, this is you could take off in this. You pop up above the clouds at like 1,500 feet AGL. But you also notice on that latest surface analysis chart, they overplot the Doppler, and there's a bunch of junk, that reflectivity on the radar, but near the radar stations in Central Texas, and that's a great teaching opportunity too. You can show your student, this is what this looks like, right? Like, that's not actually precipitation, that's false reflections out of low-lying clouds and humidity, a lot of humidity. But you look, oh, by the time we go, it'll be VFR, it'll be great weather. Good standard training session. What's also nice about this specific session is that, let's say you wanted to put a weather event into it. Well, they take off in the weather. There is that front up there to the north. You could create a situation where that front moves, gets drawn down south faster than the forecast called for, and they ended up getting into some weather on the return flight. And it would be totally plausible given this forecast, which is the ideal kind of situation that you want to have, right? You want to create, you want these scenarios to be, realistic, understandable, and ideally sort of reflective of normal conditions, but also leave the door open for a weather event to come in. The other thing that you might point out is you have that low front, that small low over the panhandle. In certain situations, that out over West Texas, in certain situations, that can actually turn into a squall line that can be pretty severe. So this would be, again, a good, if that front slides over, another 100, 150 miles to the east, it'll pick up a ton of moisture from the Gulf, and it could totally blow up into a real quick but thick and solid squall line. So these are great situations that you can show your students beforehand and create all kinds of variations from it. But when they get in the sim, they know the weather, they've briefed it just like they would in the airplane. Okay, so again, we have NOTAMs. We can talk about all this stuff that you would normally talk about with your student beforehand. And then here's our overview. So that's kind of basically what when I say real world weather, what I would pull out is I would take screenshots of, this is our flight plan, this is the nav log, this is our weather briefing, our NOTAMs, all that kind of stuff, and I just put it in a Google Drive or something like that. Here's our overview, and share it with the student. And they can use they can load ForeFlight in just like that, so they have it in the airplane. And we have tools that'll allow them to put that'll essentially trick the airplane or the iPad that they're using as though they were in the actual airplane. So it'll draw the own ship where you are flying at the time, and it could be a good way to do that. And what you do is you create a scenario with those weather conditions in it beforehand, so that when they started the flight, the weather matched what they got their briefing on. Okay, so let's go through some of these questions. All right. Okay, so one drawback of the sim to use in private pilot training is that the students who trained or played too much on the sim tend to not see outside and stick to instruments even in VFR conditions. Any suggestions? I totally agree, and it actually applies not just to sim students that learn in the sim. I think it applies to students that learn with glass cockpits, especially like the G1000. A lot of students in that environment don't really look outside. And unfortunately, the only way that I know to fix that is instructor repetition of look outside the cockpit. And the instructor has to pay very close attention to it. But I don't think it's specific just in the Redbird or just in the simulator problem. I think it's if they have big, colorful, moving map displays and all that kind of stuff, that's where their eyes naturally go to. And there is a personality trait too. Most pilots, people that want to be pilots, are probably type A. They're probably very interested in precision and perfection. And the G1000 giving altitudes in foot increments is, or really any glass panel giving altitudes at that level and airspeeds at that specific level of detail versus the round gauges where it's sort of like, it's about 80 knots, creates a situation where they're going to sit there and watch those gauges and try to get them exactly right. And that's where the instructor has to come in and say, don't worry about that. In the ballpark is fine. Let's focus on outside. Look outside, look outside, look outside, look outside. That's really, as far as I know, unless somebody has a better answer, that's the answer I have. Okay, Gary, ForeFlight's great, and I'm glad your DPs let you use it. I think that's super important. I think we need to teach and test on the tools that the students actually going to use. I still show people how to use an E6B and how to fill out would show people how to fill out a written nav log, just because that's, you know, it's our history. It's how we do things and have done things in the past. And I think it gives a good foundation. So when you look at the nav log that ForeFlight's producing, you kind of know where those numbers come from. But I haven't done a paper nav log for my own personal flight in a long, long time. So I think it's important to teach and test on those tools that we use. What do you think about using the Redbird for ground reference maneuvers? So depends on the Redbird you're talking about. If you're talking about an LD, SD, or FMX, where you have screens that come back, especially if you have one that's got the horizon expansion where the screens come even further back, and especially if you got a new one, which is 27-inch monitors, you can get really large fields of view. In those cases, totally use them for ground reference maneuvers. You can see the ground reference, everything will behave the way you expect it to, and it should work great. If you're talking about a TD or even an LD or an SD with the smaller screens without horizon, and you want to do like, especially like 8s on pylons or something like that, it gets pretty tough to do. And I would not, you could show them the procedure, right? How to set the airplane up, we enter downwind, whatever this case may be, and help them walk through what they were going to do. But I don't force it, right? If it doesn't work, if it's just going to frustrate them, don't force it in the sim. Go out to the airplane and do it. The real key is you want the sim experience to be valuable learning. And anytime either the limitations of the sim or the limitations of the student or the limitations of the instructors are going to prevent that from being really valuable learning, go do it someplace else, whether that's on the ground or outside in the airplane. Okay, so Gary, on the too much reliance on the instruments question, Gary says tape a blank piece of paper over the gauges to help make your point 90% looking outside. I think that is a fine tool. They make masks for the G1000 specifically. You can use paper. Don't pull the circuit breaker. Garmin has come out and officially said don't pull the circuit breaker. You can turn it off in our sim, right? You can, like, there's a failure mode. I am a little hesitant on using the failure mode because that's a specific, if the PDF fails or some instrument in the PDF fails, there are procedures that you need to follow if that happens, right? And so using the failure to just teach them to look outside creates kind of a weird situation, right? If I want them to, if they see red X's, I want them to know something failed. I have to follow the checklist on failed instruments and try to troubleshoot it, try to get on the ground, blah, blah, blah. If I'm just teaching look outside, I think I agree. Putting paper or something like that over it to do that, the problem with it long term is it's a crutch, right? They're not going to fly like that all the time. And once they get out of training, they're not going to fly like that. So I think that's a good first step. Show them, cover the instruments, force them, have them look outside. But eventually they're going to have to just learn internally to know they need to look outside. And a lot of that just comes from the instructor reinforcing it and building the habit pattern of I glance inside, I look outside. I glance inside, I look outside. And that's kind of the only real way to handle that is long-term is instructor reinforcement of it until they build the habit pattern. But the paper masking, all that kind of stuff can definitely help. Abdullah says, Coach is right. I'm facing the same issue here, looking for suggestions as well. I think that was about the looking at the instruments too much. Okay, so let's move on here. Okay, so we're gonna get into some examples now of a VFR training event. So if you've ever taught private pilot students, you've probably spent a significant portion of your life flying around at 2,000 feet AGL, waiting for them to figure out how to enter a pattern at an airport, a nearby airport. And they'll fly around to the next county as they're trying to figure out, oh, I got to tune the radio, and oh, well, the wind's coming from this. Where am I? Oh, how do I turn in? Well, enter on the 45, or do I go straight in for the approach? We've all, I think any instructor that's dealt with private pilot students has had that experience. I find it extremely frustrating, and it wears my patience greatly to just sort of bounce around for 20 minutes while they try to figure out how to enter the pattern. So this idea came from a student that was particularly bad at that, and I said, let's just go in the sim and try this. And what I would do is our task, we're going to introduce practice pattern entry procedures. The goal is to enter and fly normal patterns from any starting point to any runway in real time, meaning no pausing. So I'm going to do a ground brief. Great, we're going to brief the weather, we're going to brief our goals, etc. We're going to actually start in the air at 2,000 feet. So they've done their descent from cruise or wherever, and we're going to be paused. And what I might do, because this is just a little quirk of the Redbird, if you start pause, the GPS won't be in the current location necessarily. So start paused, unpause it, and then repause it like a second later, and then everything will update. The airspeed will update, the GPS, all that will update, and they'll have a current situation. And then when you're sitting paused, what's nice is that the radio works even in pause. So what they can do is they can figure out where they are, where the runway is, where the airport is. They can dial the AWOS or ASOS, listen to the weather, get the winds, figure out the active runway, and then depending on their learning style, a lot of people in this situation learn well visually. I'll have them draw it out on a piece of paper. Say, I'm here, here's the runway, this is how I'm going to enter it. Once they have it all planned out and they know exactly what they're going to do, unpause it, let them fly it until they get on the 45 or short final, wherever you want to end it. Right? Whenever you think the maneuver is, they've demonstrated their maneuver. Pause it again, relocate them someplace else. Okay, have them go through the same process, but this time try to make it faster. Unpause the flight sooner. So maybe they figure out where they are, and they figure out where the airport is, and unpause it right then. And then they can, as they're flying around, try to figure out how they're going to enter the pattern. And at first, I don't really change the active runway. I don't change the winds. I want them to get the weather every time, but I'm not changing the active runway. I'm just changing location. So I'm moving 5 miles over here, 10 miles to the south, 2 miles to the north, whatever the case may be. And they can figure out how to enter the runway. And eventually they do this enough times, usually about 10 times, you'll be able to do it and start it unpaused. So you drop them, you reposition them, everything loads, hit unpause, and they can figure out in real time while flying the airplane their location, how to enter the runway. And then at that point, what you could do is you could start varying the weather so that maybe the weather is the active runway is different, or vary the airport so that it's a totally different runway alignment, totally different weather situation or geographic situation, and do this a couple of times until they know how to enter the pattern from any place around the runway. And they can, this will save you so much frustration. This is more, I mean, it's an important skill, they'll learn it, but it saves a lot of instructor frustration. Okay, so questions? Okay, so outstanding job explaining do's and don'ts in Redbirds, as well explaining the limitations of Redbird. Thank you. I find it hard to teach pattern entry on our LD because of the visible area. Okay, so I would say pattern entry, I think you can probably do it even on the 45, like pattern entry should be okay. I definitely see the problem, can see a problem when you get beam the numbers and when you, like the base turn and all that kind of stuff. That is certainly an issue with the fact that it doesn't go back and you can't tilt your head back and look out the window, right? So, and it's limitation. And if you don't think that it's valuable or effective training, then don't do it, right? That's it. Personally, I think it's limitation, but you can work around it. And there's a lot of other things that can happen in that situation that are really good, like power management, airspeed management, altitude management, to set up for the pattern. And even if I'm verbally telling the student, okay, you're about right here, then they can do it. You can also, the distance from turning, where the base turn is both a view and about a time from when you pull the throttle back or beam the numbers. So you can teach it, a little bit both ways. And then they'll go out in the airplane and it'll click and it'll make sense. Okay, so next question, or next issue, the example IFR training event. So this one, The goal is really to fly an ILS to minimums and a bunch of range of conditions and weather and partial panel. This is a practice maneuver, not a learning maneuver, right? So the idea here is that they already know how to fly ILSs, and they've done it before. They've probably done it in a real airplane. But what you're trying to do is build a really strong habit pattern about how to brief the approach, how to set the airplane up, and how to fly it, so that in the training environment where you're going, you know, localizer, ILS, GPS, boom, 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 just like you would in a check ride, they have an extremely strong muscle memory and visual memory of how they execute this maneuver. So we're going to shoot 6 approaches, and they're going to be vectors to final approach fix. Each time they're going to brief the approach, they're going to set the airplane. We're going into the same approach each time, but I want them to brief it and set it just so they build that repetition pattern. And then we're going to do 4 approaches to minimums with landings, or right before landing, I'll just reposition them, whatever. And then 2 approaches to missed. One of those would be a briefed missed. So I'll tell them beforehand that this approach will be, you'll go missed on this approach. And one of those approaches will be unbriefed missed, right? So they're gonna fly it, they'll be flying and expecting to see the runway, and we won't show it to them, and we want them to catch it. And then we'll do a brief partial panel. So again, while they're flying around, before they get when they're on their initial vector, I'll say, okay, I'm gonna, shut down your AHRS or your heading indicator, whatever the case may be, whatever partial panel you want to talk about, and I'll tell them beforehand so they're prepared. And then I'll do one, probably either the last one or the second to last one would be, probably the second to last one would be a partial panel failure while they're on final, and see how they handle it. They may go miss, that's a fine answer, or they may continue. Also, depending on the situation, what instrument it is, blah, 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 potentially a fine answer as well. I say second to last because I probably want the last approach to be a standard normal approach that they take all the way down, see the runway, land, everybody's happy, just so we end on a positive note, right? That's just kind of basic training, end on a good note. So that's an example, and this is just about pounding it out, repetition, right? We're going to brief the flights beforehand. We're going to start in the air. We're going to cut out all the preparatory stuff where we have to take off, fly, get to an airport, etc. And we're just going to do we're going to do these approaches, bam, 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 and they'll build a lot of habit patterns. And the real key here for the instructor is to watch what the student's doing, and if they're starting to take shortcuts, or if they're starting to build negative patterns, to nip it in the bud right away. What you want to do is build a really strong foundation of the correct procedure. And I would do this type of an event for every approach type, so that they get really confident at briefing approaches quickly, loading the panel quickly, and executing the maneuver without a whole lot of conscious thought. We want them to be able to do a lot of this rote stuff just automatically, so they can put more effort and thinking into emergencies and judgment. Okay, I don't have a poll for this one because it's so wide and varied. If you have an answer, you can go ahead and type it in. But what do you think what emergency training do you think is most important for a private pilot? If we look at what we actually teach, we teach engine failures a lot. We teach some diversion, lost procedures a lot. We teach stalls, spins, loss of control kinds of things, some, but definitely if you ask a newly minted private pilot what most of their emergency training was about, they will probably say engine failure. Interestingly, engine failure are number 3 and 4 on the list of top fatal GA accidents. Loss of control and control flight into terrain, and both of those are probably more about judgments and decision making than they are about specific flight procedures or skill sets around physical manipulation of the controls. So in general, and especially unintended flight into IMC, right? That's all about judgment. Fuel related is probably about judgment as well. So I would say in general, we do not a great job of teaching judgment and decision making. So the reason I bring this up is that a lot of the stuff we talked about early on, where we're talking about setting weather for every flight and having limiting major events to 20% of the sessions, is to build the ground level base for teaching judgment and decisions later on. One of the things I hate is that a lot of sim sessions, let's say you're going to go work on it's with a private pilot and you're going to go work on steep turns in the sim, or just air maneuvers, right? They'll start the flight and it's 100% clear, no clouds, they can see for 50 miles, right? Okay, so every time they get in the sim and it's clear, they know that there's not going to be any weather problems. And then the one time they get in the sim and you're trying to sneak in a weather event on them so that they can practice their judgment making, all of a sudden there's clouds. Well, you just gave it away, right? Even if the clouds aren't low right now, you gave it away that there's clouds, there's going to be something to do with weather happening here. So I highly, highly, highly recommend that every time you get in the sim, there is some weather of some kind. It's fairly rare that you have 100% clear skies and 50 miles of visibility. Now, sure, there are places in the country where that happens, but in general, just put some cirrus up there. Put some clouds at 10,000 feet, just a little bit, just so there's always some weather in there. So when they hop in the sim, and a lot of times the weather has nothing to do with the training event, right? You're not going to try to trick them with the weather, but the 1 or 2 times that you try to get them into a situation where they have to make a judgment call, right? You're working on steep turns prior to a check ride. You're working on air maneuvers prior to a check ride, and they get in the sim, and they've been in the sim 20 other times, and 5 of the other times there's been a cloud layer at 5,000, overcast cloud layer at 5,000 feet. They get in the sim, overcast cloud layer at 5,000 feet. They go up to 3,500, and as they're working on their air work, you're lowering the cloud layer down 100 or 200 feet at a time, and then after 20 minutes, all of a sudden they're below VFR minimums. The clouds are right above them, and we can lower the cloud layers down again to try to get them to recognize it. Right? That is a decision and judgment scenario that you build starting at the very beginning of the training by the way you set the simulator up. So it's things like that I recommend. And that's that. I think we're wrapping up. I have one more. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. I think we'll go through that one more time. So engine failure procedures and loss of systems are my number one. This is Gary. As I get more actual flight time, I add other conditions. Yeah, I agree. Loss of systems and engine failure procedures are definitely things to teach. I mean, it's obviously if we look at this list, right? Number 3, number 6 are system failures, power plant or non-power plant. And fuel related probably means engine failure, honestly. But I think we talk about those specific things a lot because they're in the ACS and because we have procedures for them in the POH, right? If you think about what's tested is what gets taught, and what we have procedures for is what gets taught. Things like, how do I manage a weather situation that I wasn't expecting, or how do I manage a especially if you get into IFR training later on, it can be really, there's some really creative things you can do around in cockpit distractions, like they're flying with their family and there's a crying toddler or something like that. You can try to teach that in the sim. How do you manage in cockpit distractions? And there's not bad weather. Maybe it's just standard IFR, but you have on your phone a crying toddler that you start playing. Like, to be creative about it and teach those kind of situations, because I'll bet you loss of control in flight, there's some of those accidents that happen because there were people in the cockpit that were distracting the pilot. So we should teach that, even though it's not on the ACS, and even though there's not a specific printed procedure for it. The sim is a great place to teach that. All right, so that's our questions. Unless there's any more, we're going to wrap up here in about 5 minutes or so, but I'm going to just run through these one more time because this is kind of the gist of it. Instructors must reinforce the value, having a goal, making it realistic, and and keeping things, don't overdo it as far as failures and training and pausing. Make sure the student is still learning and getting valuable instruction from it. And you really want these, like, they're learning important skills and they need to take it seriously. But these training events should be, on the whole, an enjoyable experience. You don't want to create these really, like, why, you know, from a business perspective, why would you want to create awful experiences for your customers, right? Yes, it's a serious thing and we need to take it serious, but we don't need to make it just miserable while we do it. And so I think that officially wraps it up. I appreciate everyone's time. If you have questions, info@redbirdflight.com, or you can email me, jharnagel@redbirdflight.com. That's JHARNAGEL@redbirdflight.com. Thanks, appreciate it.